understand the value of that in getting along with people, but sometimes we need to hear the other side. You're the only one who really matters. That one certainly speaks to us. That's not a thought that we should have as Christians. We think of others and think less of self. Don't let anyone run over you. That's real in a lot of ways. So I understand that one. Get what you can while you can still get it. Another statement. Wendy likes that one, huh? Get it while you can. But again, we're not leading selfish lives. And if anything, we're benevolent to others. So you're seeing the statements just encouraging you to look at some of those. This is one I've heard years ago, not so much now. All you have to do is to believe in God. Or everyone has a right to their own belief about God. And those are certainly still alive and well. And people that don't want to change their religious thinking, suggesting that all that matters is that we believe in God, don't read 1 John. And it talks about if we don't have Christ, we don't have God. So they go hand in hand. But those are the type statements that we are encouraged to think about and possibly we've heard before. The one I see most that's on the list is the feeling that most people believe everyone's going to heaven. And most people believe everyone who has died is looking down from heaven. And there's two faulty thinking there. We don't die and go to heaven. We go to a waiting place called Abraham's bosom, waiting for the second coming. But I also don't think anywhere in Scripture are we told that people who have died can see what we go through on earth. Now, when you look at the rich man, and he was in the opposite of paradise, he was in torment, and he begged Lazarus to send someone, and of course through Lazarus others, send someone back to earth so my brothers won't come here. So he knew what they believed. He knew that if they did not change their belief system, they would be right where he was. And he wanted them to have a warning. But that doesn't mean that he saw them on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock to see what they were doing. Nothing tells us that. So we don't go to heaven right away, and we do enter eternal time, but we also don't have people who are aware of our actions as they have left this earth, aware of our actions on this earth. I think I'm hearing more. There's a lot going on out there today. And Leo and Grant are not guarding our parking lot, so maybe we're being inundated with crime right now. Who knows? But turn to Matthew 5. This is one of the early teachings of Christ. We don't know a time frame, but it was certainly in the early years of his public ministry. And he gives us insight into things that we would not have seen otherwise. It's the opposite of what you would think. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So you think about the concept of poor, and yet they're inheriting a kingdom. And those are the key words that get your attention. But the reality is it's those who are poor in spirit, those who realize their spiritual poverty, those who understand their need for others. There's ways to say the same thing, but what you gain is much, much greater than what you may feel as if you've lost. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I've written over the years things in my margin that speak to these things. Poor in spirit, you have a humble station in life. You have a dependence on God, and that certainly is the opposite of, I think about myself, or I get it when I can. That's two or three statements that we did think about for a moment. Those who mourn, you're mourning for others' sins. You're mourning for your own sin. Godly sorrow would be included in this concept. But there is comfort promised when we are that kind of person. It's really a disposition. It's describing the kind of character that we would have in life. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. Meek is something powerful yet under control. A horse is usually the example that's given. A horse is powerful, a lot of muscles, and yet a bridle and a sixth grader can control it. It's power under control, and that's really, I wrote down teachable, a controlled will. I wrote down a spiritual victory over earthly things. So several things might come to mind. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. I remember a story I read. I think Warren Wiersbe wrote it in one of his books, the B series. He talked about an elderly gentleman who was walking with a young person, and they were talking about these type of things, and this one younger person just seemed at a loss to be hungry for something, and to be hungering and thirsting for righteousness. He wanted to be sure he understood that one. So he took him out to a body of water, and he said, "Now I want you to trust me, but I want you to learn this lesson." And very gently but firmly, he took his head and put it under water. And he kept it there just a little bit longer than he normally would, to where the young person was kind of pushing to come up. He says, that's what you need to be towards spiritual things. As you were pushing up for air, as you were needing air, as you were putting an effort behind getting to air, that's what hungering and thirst for righteousness is. Now, James Dobson and Chuck Swindoll and others in years past would make this statement about it. We need to create a thirst in our children. Create a thirst and hungering for spiritual things. That's the gift we need to give them. And it's a gift can go on giving once they've left home. If they have a desire for spiritual things, that's the best gift that we can give them. And certainly we could not refute that. But if we have that thirst for righteousness, we will gain that righteousness. And I describe righteousness as that right standing before God. Have that hunger and thirst to be right before God. What does God want? What does God require? I think that one maybe speaks more than others. And the other side of the coin is someone who's greedy for gain rather than spiritual things. Terry, you had a comment? Yeah, it can. I think it can. Yeah, it's not going to happen to them if it doesn't happen to you, unless they leave home and get under someone else's influence And under that influence, they develop a passion for spiritual things. That's what student centers, Bible chairs are good for in America. Many universities, not Christian universities, but state universities, have places and congregations and activities to where the young people who are looking for spiritual things have a place to come to be encouraged by their peers and by others. And some of them are changed inside out, very much different than maybe what they were given or shown at home. But it's just the reality of how interested are you, and should we be, how interested in spiritual things? And if we are, we will be filled, using the metaphor of hungering and thirst. We will be filled. It has the ability to fill us up. It has the ability to meet that need. How many of you have heard the idea that God places an empty place within us that only He can fill? That's the idea. Young people are looking to so many things, and when we were young, we were the same way. And we chase after so much that isn't able to fulfill us, to fill us full, to say the same thing slightly different. God made us. He knows what we need. He knows what He wants to supply. And He creates a void that only He can fill. Now, I think it's true also in the idea of those who have this very strong need to be married and needing to be married to fulfill something within you. And I think that's something that can be similar to that. But certainly it's a reality, I think, that I have sensed it, I have felt it, and others tell me they can see the same idea. They never felt full until they came into a realization of the relationship with God through Christ. And it just changed them. It made them what God wanted them to be, quite frankly, Brian. Yeah, vanity, chasing after the wind, finally fear God and keep His commandments, the whole of man. The conclusion to all of it. I think Solomon was going through a midlife crisis, maybe late in life crisis, and he does us a favor if we will listen to him. If we have to experience everything firsthand, his story doesn't help us much. But it can if we will learn from one of the wisest men who's ever walked upon the earth. And he received that wisdom from God. So, yes, without question, a conclusion that's a good one. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. I wrote down compassion, another companion word. My mother used to say, if you give a smile, you get a smile. And that principle, I think, is true here. If you are merciful to other people, they will extend that mercy to you. Grace and mercy is a good idiom to live by. Extend grace and mercy to people. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't think you know everything about a situation based upon what little involvement you've had in watching someone or seeing their reaction. An idiom that's come out in recent years: don't make a judgment about a person based upon the worst event in their life. Because we all have those worst events from time to time. Doesn't mean it's the worst of worst, but we should not make judgments, and I'm not talking about heaven or hell, but firm judgments about people based upon little information or one event that may have happened that was real and there were consequences. But again, extend mercy and you will have mercy extended to you. People will mirror that reaction towards you if you've given it to them. Any comments there? Does that make sense? Do we agree that that's a truism in our life? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Excuse me. I have written down sincerity, a clean motive, purpose, freedom from evil desire. There's several ideas that would reveal the pure in heart. But without it, we will not see God. He will not tolerate or fellowship sin. Willful sin, God wants nothing to do with it. And He's offered that which will deal with sin in our life. But purity is important. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. I know people, you do too, that seem to stir things up much more than they try to calm things down. I use a phrase from time to time, don't create unnecessary drama. I don't like drama. My son got that from me. He doesn't like conflict. I just think sometimes we stir things up for the thrill that it gives us, and we don't understand the consequences of that kind of meddling, another word that I think fits. Don't stir things up. Gossip does that. Slander does that, and those two things we're warned against in Scripture. Be a peacemaker. Give the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume quickly that you understand what's just happened or why something was said. Brian? Yeah. Yeah, so far as it depends upon us, live at peace with all people, especially those of the household of faith. Be a person who assumes and gives the benefit of the doubt. And that's hard for some people. Some people may be raised or spent a lot of time around the opposite, and it's hard to change because you've been told by others' actions that you can determine something about that action. And maybe a little, but if you grew up around people who would tend to make overt statements about something as if they knew everything about that person, every motivation that brought about that desire or that statement, we just can't. We don't. Be a peacemaker and a son or daughter of God, and that's generic, but it's the same idea. Liz? Yeah. Sure. Oh, yeah, yeah. Our actions can do that, and certainly to encourage it, to be a participant in that in our life. I think this statement is on the door as we leave our house. Let me think of how it's worded. Terry may remember how she wrote it. But a quiet answer, I'm forgetting the phrase. Quiet answer, yeah. Gentle answer turns. I couldn't think of the turn part. Gentle answer turns away wrath. Our response can heat things up or calm things down. My dad used to talk about count to 7. What I found out, and he knew it, what I found out, it doesn't take 7. It's usually just 1 or 2. If you'll stop and think, it doesn't take counting to 7 for you to act better or not overreact. But that idea of just stopping and counting to 7, but it doesn't take 7. If you have to count to 7, unless it's really, really fast, you have some issues that need to be dealt with more than something simple. A hot temper, it's that adrenaline rush, and that's what a temper is. Our adrenaline is just heightened when something exciting happens, when something scary happens. It's a natural thing that's built into our bodies, but that adrenaline rush is the thing that gives us the excitement. How many of you watching college football yesterday, did your team win? And if you watch it, you get excited when something happens and they're ahead. But the same adrenaline rush is there sometimes when you might be given toward a fight, an excitement that could be negative. I won't mention whose children, but I know a discussion was held by a mom and dad with one of their children at a school one day, and they came home and said, "Mom, you won't believe what happened, so-and-so," and they started telling a story about a small group of people who got into a fight. And the quick response of the parents was, "How do you know?" He says, "Well, I went to see it. I wanted to see it." And there's some of us drawn to go to see a fight, and there's some of us that are wise enough to turn and go the other way. And that's sometimes a little bit of who we are. But to get back to the verse, peacemakers don't enjoy people fighting. If anything, try to calm yourself down, and that can calm others down. Verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." We saw the idea in 1 Peter in that study that if we suffer because of actions of our own that are wrong, that's not a benefit to us. That's not a suffering that we get spiritual credit for. The suffering that we get a spiritual credit for is we're persecuted because of our right standing before God, because of our right principles, because of our character, because of Christ living in us. That's the persecution that will serve as the acid test for whether or not we will enter into the kingdom. If we are ashamed of Christ here, we're not going to be there because we've revealed ourselves. I don't necessarily believe this statement, but some have said if we don't enjoy worship here, God's going to do us a great service by not forcing us to be in worship for eternity. I understand what they're saying, but there are some things that will keep us out of heaven. And if we don't stand up for the cause of Christ, our response will keep us from that kingdom of heaven. Our willingness to suffer, and that doesn't mean we look for it, bring it on, or do things that draw attention to us so as to be in a suffering position. But if we suffer for righteousness' sake, there is the reward of the kingdom of heaven. And any other dynamic we can quibble over, figure it out, or try to slice it up to figure out how we can just barely get in. I'm not that kind of person. I don't think you are either. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. There's the clincher. Because of me, they're doing those things. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. What's an idiom that says the same thing from that verse 12? We're in good company. We're in good company if we are being persecuted, insulted, all kinds of evil things against us because of Christ. We're in good company because it's happened to others before us. Trying to look at the direction that the material wanted us to go. I want to honor it without being hamstrung with it. John 15, let's look at a set of verses there, making similar points. It's discussing a new lifestyle, a new person, and obviously for new Christians, these verses can be life-changing to realize the need for a drastic change, perhaps. A reminder for some of us that we need to be growing in these areas day by day. Doesn't happen overnight, doesn't always remain that way. We can slip back and be less that meek person. We can slip back and be less that person who's aware of other people, to where we will be mourning for them and their circumstance or sin. I started working on a lesson this week called the sin doctrine. Not sure when I'll preach it, but I got the idea and I just kind of pulled some things together. But these are reminders that are good for us. John 15, verse 18. Good company. Well, this is the opposite of that. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. Why don't people like me? I'm a good person. I'm trying to be a Christian. Why would they persecute you? Why would they make fun of you? Why would they say and do the things against you? John will give us the answer. It's light and darkness. We'll go there if we have time. But Jesus is trying to teach the apostles in this circumstance that it happened to me first. And I've heard people say that we shouldn't make things personal because it's not really us that they're not listening to. It's not us that they're refusing to be taught of. Jesus says they're not refusing you, they're refusing God. It's not you, it's God that's being discounted. And if Jesus said that, certainly it would be true of our circumstances. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. If you never have conflict, if no one ever questions your spiritual standing, if no one ever laughs about your spiritual disciplines, it may be because no one knows it. You're not light, salt, leaven. You're keeping it quiet. There's a point to where if we are who we should be, there will be some response to it. I was thinking of a football coach. When I went into campus ministry, I was asked to write a weekly sports column for the local Murfreesboro paper. I had been in sports writing for 7 years full time, and they knew that. The person who was the editor of that newspaper was the editor 2 years when I was the sports editor of the college newspaper for those 3 years. And I would go interview the football coach. And he knew I was a campus minister. And he would tease me about, Gary, you don't ever have fun. You don't have fun. I says, Boots, his nickname Boots, James Boots Donnelly. I said, Boots, the difference from you and me is I go to a party on Saturday night, and the next morning I know where I was, who I was with, and exactly what I said and did. And all he could do was laugh, because he was talking about drinking. You don't have fun. You don't drink, and probably other things too. But I enjoyed the banter with him from time to time. He was respectful, so was I. But he was probably curious to see what my response would be. It didn't come up ever again in the year that I was doing that. We have control, discipline. And Peter talked about when we will not go and do the things we used to do, and they think it's strange that we no longer do those things with them. It's a real life situation. I'm curious, I want to share it. You probably don't care. There's a lot of cupcake football games yesterday to where the good teams were ahead 35-0. And Boots explained that to me. They would gladly go somewhere against the SEC football team, and you would get paid a lot of money that you would never otherwise get, and then you would use that money to win the other 9 games. My alma mater went to Alabama yesterday, and they got soundly defeated, but they walked home with expenses paid in over $1 million. And they'll use that to win the other 9 games. So that's what takes place in these early games of September. Anyway, information you didn't need to hear. You can never unhear it, but it's not that you needed it. Verse 19, as it is, you do not belong to the world. He says to his 12, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. So I've called you out of the world, but it's going to bring a world response towards you. What happened to all the apostles? How did they die? Martyrdom. John put on the Isle of Patmos and eventually martyred as well, but he was the last living. They were martyred. We saw in our church history study Wednesday that many of the first century Christians, Domitian, Nero, just terrible martyrdom because they chose to follow Jesus Christ, and they refused to bow down to Caesar. They refused to say something as simple as Caesar is Lord. They would not, they could not, because Caesar was not Lord. And but it's real. Verse 20, we're in John 15. Remember the words I spoke to you, no servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. So a similar response toward the good and a similar response toward the negative. And that's the benefit. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. And so he takes it back. It's not me, it's God. They don't know God. They're not aware of God in their life. And they're responding to me because of that. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. Now, however, they have no excuse for their sin. A lot of people really misunderstand that statement. I use the statement of Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. No, it's not 1 Corinthians. Let me look for a second. As soon as I said it, Romans 7. Romans 7. He makes the acknowledgement that sin, verse 8, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. And he seems to suggest that he did not really know what coveting was. And then he was introduced to coveting, and sin grabbed hold of it, trying to move him to being covetous, if you will. So sin, knowing something, can cause sin to act with that knowledge to bring about a sin. It would be similar, I think, if someone were to come into a setting in America and there were certain things that were against the law, but they don't know it, and they don't think about it, and they act normal, if you will, and then suddenly you are made aware of something and it's a law-breaking situation, and they're drawn toward it. There's an impulse toward it because of the knowledge. I think the easiest way to describe it is wet paint on a bench. Ever been in that situation? You walk along and someone says, "Don't touch wet paint." What do you want to do? You want to see if it's really wet. You could have walked by there 1,000 days in a row and never cared about that bench. Wet paint, don't touch. Suddenly you're drawn toward it. And some people have to go over and, yeah, it is wet. As if somebody's trying to trick them. Jeremy? Yep. There you go. We might be more inclined. Why would I keep walking? But who cares? Just do it. I use the same idea, and I think it's true, with a babysitter or parents. Friday night, you're leaving the house, babysitter's there with your children, and you turn around and say to your 3 children, whatever you do, do not watch television at 8:30 on CBS. And what are they going to do? They're going to sneak into the back room out of curiosity and figure out what is it that we can't watch on CBS at 8:30. If you'd never mentioned it, it would not be in their awareness. It's just a fact of life. The things we say matter. The things we discourage sometimes can quicken and appeal toward it. It can make them want something they never would have wanted. And I appreciate the reality. Yes? Yeah. And God certainly tells us to think of those things that are pure and right and trustworthy or whatever. Well, I hope I haven't encouraged you to go turn the TV on a Friday night at 8:30 on CBS. That was only an example. I have no idea what's on at a given time, but it's a reality. And Paul, knowing about something, sin used that knowledge to draw him toward it. And it's just a reality. So it's our responsibility to control our thinking and think about spiritual things. That's, of course, the summation of all that we've said. Be a person who's thinking about spiritual things. That's your mindset. That's your devotion. That's your character. That's the development of your personality. Thank you.